Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of the BotPod in our Tech Talk series. Today, I'm being joined by Eleanor Tang-Smith, a trailblazer in robotics and one of the driving forces behind the newly rebranded OLO Robotics. Eleanor's had a really remarkable journey in the field, still really heavily dominated by men, shaping cutting edge software robotic solutions whilst mentoring the next generation of talent. So, thank you so much for joining me today. I've got to say, I'm really looking forward to this one, Eleanor. But before we dive in, can you tell me and us a little bit more about your background, what really inspired you to pursue a career in robotics?
It's a pleasure to be here today, Danielle. I was really looking forward to recording this with you as well. And it's obviously a very exciting field, robotics. So actually, my background is primarily with software. I've been in the software industry for about 15 years now, and really, it's always been the user and the customer at the heart of it, and that's how my career has evolved. I started off in projects in pharmaceuticals, um, again working with software, and that progressed to some different industries, and then ultimately um, working in robotics about 18 months ago. So whilst that journey is still young, fundamentally it's about software, and being co-founder and COO of OLO Robotics has been a very interesting challenge, and it's an incredibly interesting landscape to work with.
I love that. And within this episode, we'll really be kind of exploring that journey of women in robotics, overcoming barriers, and how we're really driving innovation in what is such a male-dominated field. So if we're talking about the current landscape as it stands today, like Eleanor, tell me where women are making the biggest impact in robotics today, or from what you see in your day to day.
I think there's still it's still rare, actually. I think that, if we look at the landscape of robotics and we look at what is out there, there are a lot of companies led by men in this field still, and there's very few, I think, a handful globally led by female CEOs. And so that I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
And I guess then, do we have any stats, trends, or women around robotics, VC investments, or the broader industry landscape that you've kind of followed or had your eye on?
I mean, just broadly, even in investment in female-led businesses, the numbers are a bit shocking. We've had this sort of 2% of funding for women-led businesses banding around for a while. I've seen some, promising or at least hopeful stats where that is changing a little bit, and I think that's a lot to do with women in different spaces trying to put an effort towards it. We're very fortunate, funded by a Northern VC company, Northern Gritstone, where they kind of really value having 50-50 women on their committee to make sure that investments are being diversified. And I think that's the really important part. So even in the overall funded space, it's already very small numbers. So in terms of female-led robotics businesses being funded, there really aren't that many out there, but some really cool ones are leading spaces in health tech, and or in social interactions as well.
I do have that little pet peeve where you see female femtech companies that are meant and built for women but are founded by men. It really grinds my gears. I won't talk about them, but just comes to the back of my mind when you say things like that. But I love the fact there seems to be more of an emergence of female-led businesses, not just for social interaction or kind of female health, but in various regions, even like what you've been doing in the software robotics world as well.
Yeah.
Um, but if we look back at, I guess, your journey over the years, I'd love to hear what your pivotal moments have been that have really shaped that career, not just in robotics, but outside of that, that's led you to where you are today.
I think the most interesting aspect of my career journey is that I didn't start off coding, and I still don't. I'm not a programmer, but I've worked a lot with product teams. And so as I said, keeping the user at the core of it has always been the theme throughout my career. Understanding what people need in the real world and being able to build a product that meets those needs, that generate real outcomes, is where I've followed it through and been successful in sort of on the career ladder, because that's what it's about. So it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're building a product for people, you need to be working with people on it. And it's very easy, I think, for certain aspects of tech teams where they have assumptions and sort of aspirations and dreams about building the perfect product and building something that, once we release it, it's going to be loved by all, right? But the reality of product building is very different to that, and it requires a lot of building in building with the customer and building with them in mind, and kind of doing it in an iterative way. And I think that's sometimes the difficulty, is that we strive for perfection, but actually how we get to perfection is incremental.
That word perfection is really interesting, because perfect to one is imperfect to another, whether it's a customer or a manager. So that's a really interesting point. But you also mentioned there that you're not a coder, you're not a programmer by trade, but you've always been in this software world, whether it's been more product or project-led teams. But how did you, I guess, I speak to engineers every day, and people from graduate levels to individuals who haven't been to university. How did you get into that specific software space, whether robotics or not, without that programming background? I think some people listening to this could be really interested in that step up of whether it's you were just given an opportunity and trust, and it kind of fell that way for you, or how did that kind of be?
I think I kind of landed in software, if I'm honest.
Okay.
It was first job out of university, and actually I studied forensics, which has nothing to do with
Interesting.
robotics or coding at all. But it taught me, how to follow methodology, and it gave me a sort of strong background in evidence-based approaches. So I think actually two aspects of my career that changed things was being able to provide a different perspective. And I think that's often from being the only person that's different in the room, and that still happens on a day-to-day. And then the second part to that is being brave enough to actually raise your hand and say, hey, have we thought about this in a different way? And then you become the connector, right? So sometimes you have people building products in isolation and assumptions, as I've said, but really what needs to happen is that there's a connector, and it's not always a natural process to connect very technical people with the end users. And so I think a lot of it was me becoming a bridge between kind of connecting people who are using the product or using something to people who are building it, and understanding that actually we all have the same goals, is to make this work for the right person. And yeah, that really changed things for me.
Okay. No, I love that. And I think that's a really interesting kind of touch point piece that would lead into the concept of almost breaking barriers, right? So you came from, as you mentioned, a very different background. And if you're looking at people who are hiring software and STEM style roles today, they have these specific requirements of certain degrees, certain levels, certain languages, and seem less open. So how would you see that bridge in hiring in this space or employing in this space in a different way if people don't come from these traditional backgrounds, and to break that barrier to entry?
I think it's about adaptability, right? So certain people and their attitudes are always going to get them pretty far, even perhaps without the specific bullet points on a CV. And I think if you are generally, if you are a person that's passionate about something and you're willing to learn, I think a lot of points on CVs can be learned, and can easily be picked up. by people who have the right attitude. And I think that's the approach that we generally take. I think attitude gets you very, very far. And if you've got a track record of adapting to different environments and delivering, in sort of different places, but using similar skill sets and being able to solve new problems, I don't think it's necessarily that you have to fill, 100% or, sort of aspects of the CV before you apply or before we decide to bring someone on board as well.
Okay, it's interesting. I think just on my recruiter head on, it's something that I always get really interested. I speak to people like you, hiring managers every day, who have very different views on expectations and bullet points in a CV, as you said. But I guess then if we're looking at a different side of the barriers, as you and me are very well aware, I'm sure our listeners are pretty well aware too, is robotics is still a massively dominated field, right? So like I think the stats are in most European countries, somewhere around like 18% of like engineers being female is a pretty drastic statistic. Again, probably less so when you're looking at mechatronics and hardware over software as well. I'd actually be scared to look at that exact stat. But what are, I guess, some of the common challenges that women or even you specifically have faced kind of in this space, whether it's from like a leading and co-founding perspective or just trying to build up your own career, and how would you recommend these being addressed?
I think sometimes it's hard to diverge away from what you know, right? So it's kind of like, I'm comfortable with this, there's a history to this, and this is how things are done, or this is how things should look. I think it takes real courage to say, maybe someone else is bringing a different perspective or taking a different approach, and that's because of the background and the experience that they've had in their life. And I think what's generally missing in the industry, and we're talking about robotics specifically, but I would say the same for AI, is that these technologies are now touching everybody's lives, and we want lots of people to benefit from these technologies. And if we continue building things in isolation and not really looking at the diversity factor in there and the mass of people that it could serve, I think number one, your product, you could end up risking missing, a part of the demographic, or a particular group of people. And the really bad side to it is actually building something that is only accessible by a few and with certain privileges. And I think that that's a very, very dangerous place to be. And that is why diversity in technology and building new things is really important, especially at the speeds that we're able to build things at now.
Mm. And I guess with that then, were there any specific challenges you faced throughout your career in kind of, in this really heavily dominated space? Anything that, again, don't need to name drop anything specifically, of course, but like, is there anything that you'd be like, hey, actually this happened and this is something I would envision to address in a different way?
I think that the we talked a little bit about perfection, and I think that's the bit that I'm going to bounce off from, is that there's perfection and then there's the not enough, right? So I'm not enough of a tech expert, I'm not enough of an expert in this, that, or the other. And then you go, oh, I just need to get another qualification, or I just need to do another course, I just need to do this other thing. And I think when there have been times where I've been presented with opportunities, maybe not directly to me, I've kind of gone, maybe I don't know everything right there, but I do think I have a perspective. And it's being able to address that and say, no, I am going to put my hand up and I am going to put my voice into the ether, and I am going to be courageous enough to say, if it's wrong, it's fine, I can walk away from that, and that's okay. And I think we worry too much sometimes. Everybody worries about being perfect and getting things right, but actually I think you learn things by getting things wrong too.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's like probably one of the definitions of like robotics: you fail to build and break, and if you can't break it, why can't you break it, and how do we like fix, fail, break, and go again? I think it's really interesting the word you use there being courage. Like when I look at job applicants and CVs day to day, the amount of like people who don't have X, Y, and Z requirements, or like it's really typical for the male population to just apply to something if they have, let's say, 2 out of 9 requirements.
Mhm.
But typically women wouldn't apply if they didn't have at least 7 out of 9. And it's almost that like courage of, do you know what, let's try it. And I feel like maybe it's something that has been drilled in throughout education or like various challenges that people face, but women steer away from something when they don't see themselves as perfect, instead of actually let's try and challenge that and show them why I could be right if I'm not perfect. And it's that interesting middle ground.
Yeah, I also think I take quite a different perspective, and it's helped me a lot in my career when things like that have come up, is that actually, like I said, you can learn from things, even if, say, you apply for something and you don't get it, there's still things to be learned from that. But fundamentally, I go from the sort of actually one of my really good friends, she's all about curiosity. And I go from that angle. It's kind of like, okay, well, I think I'm curious about this company. I really want to understand, what they do and how they work. And naturally, if you approach it from a curiosity rather than saying, oh, here's the things I'm all missing, so I need to overcompensate on these things that I do have and try to impress you, when you're going for a job interview or you're moving into those spaces, it's much more about, being curious so you can find fit, being curious so you can, ask questions that may not come to you if you're just narrowing down on a CV. And it's also about your relationship with the people who are interviewing you, right? And I think to build relationships, there needs to be some kind of authenticity, and that authenticity comes from knowing yourself and knowing whether or not you actually, want to try in this space. And those have often been the most fruitful conversations I've ever had, purely following my curiosity, asking all the questions that maybe you go, I'm not sure I should be asking that. Ask it anyway, because you get to learn something interesting. And I think those have been the interactions that have made an impression, and also, kind of showcases the way that you think, and the way that perhaps you could be thinking in their organization, even if you don't exactly meet every single bullet point or criteria or things like that.
I love that. And I think, the curiosity aspect, especially in the world we're in now, is so important. And not just because everything's run by like AI and new things that have been built over the past 5, 10, 15 years. It didn't exist previously, or even, more recently than that. But it's, the asking the what, why, when, where, how type of questions. And if you're not curious, you lack that almost step forward and able to learn and challenge yourself in a different way. So I love the curiosity piece. It's something that, I mean, I always have questions to ask. It's one of my favorite things, is just another question, just so I understand fully. And I guess with that, like we've spoken previously, and you're of course part of, Women in Tech Nottingham. So like initiatives, communities, networks, all of these types of places in physical or virtual community, I think, are such an important place to learn all of these skills and like gain the different insights. But I see a lot of these, gaining traction. And you're of course a really big part of, Women in Tech Nottingham as well for robotics. So what do you think has made programs like that as well really like effective in like your experience?
I think it's because everybody, they want it. What I found most in those spaces is not necessarily, um, it, of course there's things to learn, and of course there's interesting speakers and interesting topics. What I've found most valuable in going to those meetups, networking events and stuff, is actually a support network, is being able to find other people who understand specifically the things that you as a woman might be going through, and be able to kind of get, you have a kind of kindred spirits to bounce ideas off, and to know that you're not, over being overthinking or different things like that. Because I think, there are places where you can find a mentor, and there are things that a mentor can help you do, but sometimes it helps to kind of just talk things out loud with a group of people who understand your situation. And yeah, it is like co-creating. You kind of go, oh, hey, I have this problem, and this person's had experienced it in this area, and another person has a different view. And then by that sort of discussion at the end of it, through your own experience, you kind of go, okay, I really like that what she said about that. I really like that approach. So what do I want to try? And that's actually the biggest benefit that I found going into those groups. But clearly these spaces are needed where, I find that, especially for women in tech events, what's really cool about that is that there's less pressure, and it's feels easy, because you've got a room full of people that you're familiar with at times, and have shared experiences. And sometimes that is a little bit more difficult when you're in a room where you're the only one that's different. And that's where all these sort of things come up, where you go, oh, should I say what I'm thinking, or I think I need to impress this person, or I need to be impressing people with my background, and all the rest of this sort of stuff. It's just that at women in tech events, it feels much more at ease, and I think they're desperately wanted and needed. And so we are trying to get that up and running again in 2026.
And again, it's something that I really care about a lot, in terms of, it's like what you mentioned, it's like being in an inviting space. There's thought sharing and knowledge sharing and thought leadership that happens in a work and business and corporate environment. When you put that into a shared space of a women in tech meetup or a networking event, it does seem to translate really, really differently. I think that's something that people don't necessarily think about, of like, why am I going to this event? Why am I part of this community? It's not to necessarily Billy Big or bollocks and show yourself off in a certain aspect. It's really to learn in a welcoming environment and ask questions that maybe you'd be concerned to ask outside of that environment, that would maybe bring you the courage, or like change your thoughts of how you would bring it up when you're, the different person in the room.
And I think it sticks out to me, like one conversation that I had, where sometimes it's difficult for people to understand why that environment is more comfortable than, let's say, you go to a big tech event and you've got all these speakers on stage. And quite often I've been to quite a few tech events where there is very small proportion of female speakers. I've been to some event where there are absolutely none, and you don't see your representation up there. So you have to try and imagine it yourself. And I think quite a lot of our journeys, that is it. You have to try and figure it out yourself, but it does make it easier when you have seen someone else do it. And when we share those stories of courage and of change and all these other things, you just kind of go, oh, maybe I could do it. And so then you take that step. And so yeah, they're very valuable. And it's that there is a difference between being in a space where everyone can interact and exchange stories, but there is that specific space where the majority understand your experience.
And I feel like I would answer this question in my own way, with something you mentioned being the word curiosity. But like, what would you say to women who are thinking about getting into robotics or, STEM careers today? Like, what piece of advice would you give?
I would,
or many pieces of advice.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, obviously you want to do something that you're passionate about and you enjoy. But honestly, if you enjoy it, absolutely go right into it, because this field, STEM is an amazing field and very interesting, and it drives our everyday, and we should be part of it. And it is sad, because I have spoken to a few people who are later on in their careers who actually started out in tech and decided to drop out, or to no longer be part of that environment, because they didn't feel welcome, or they just didn't progress in the way that they imagined, and they're watching their counterparts perhaps like move up the career ladder faster. It can be really disheartening, but in the last few years I've seen a lot of positive change, and people are starting to address it more and more. And it's just really important that if you have a sort of love for it, even if it's hard, go do it, and then find your crew, find your support group, because they're the people that push you through, and they are out there, I promise. you there will be times in the journey where you're going to feel quite alone, but you're never alone. And once you reach out to those communities, you'll realize how common those stories are in that group. But yeah, I would say go for the thing that you love and enjoy, and absolutely take a career up in STEM.
I love that. And I think it's almost flipping the mindset as well. It's not the question of why should I, it's why shouldn't I? Like what is stopping me? Like why should I not do this? Why can I not do this? So I really like that. And I guess something that we've touched on before outside of this podcast as well is, and it's something I'm really curious to hear more about, the word curiosity comes again, is really your view on how the mixture of creativity, innovation, and leadership kind of really comes together in robotics or in your career.
I mean, the thing is about robotics now is that I think we're on this edge. Everything is coming together. So, you've got all this amazing hardware. We're obviously pulling together some amazing software for it. But, there is this sort of spark, I think, that is being ignited in this community, where that creativity is coming. I think there's a lot of aspects where we're seeing robots do really cool stuff, and we've seen a lot of flashy demos. But what are the real life applications that can really be possible now, beyond watering your plants, or doing sort of the mundane things like in automation warehouses and stuff. I think the creative side of it is really looking for those opportunities where it can make an impact. And I think we're there. The tools are out there, the hardware's out there, and you have to connect the creative people to it. One, I think there's a really interesting aspect, if we're talking direct creativity, is that we've been working with people in the entertainment industry, and what's really cool about people who are very much living creativity on a day-to-day is that you give them a thing, and then the possibilities are endless, right? You can see the way that they talk, that there's lots of things sparking. Our job now in this sort of space, as leaders in this space, is to bridge the gap between the crazy wild stuff and then the possible, to be able to get towards the crazy wild stuff, right? So you can't start with, oh, I want a robot to do like all these really cool, amazing things that, in the end, it's like, it will be possible one day, but we've got to be brave enough to start. We need to experiment. We need to, like, again, iterate this journey. And you still need a diverse group of people to do that, right? So you need the people who are like, okay, we need to think about health and safety. We need to think about, like, how this is scalable and what the long-term plans of this are. And then you need the people, okay, I can organize the people to do that. I can connect everyone to the right parts of it. And then you have the people who are like, oh, I have this crazy idea. And you need the diversity of that group to make something amazing. And I think that applies to product, that applies to robotics, it applies everywhere. And I think we could do with more of that.
I love it. And I think, yeah, it all comes down to, as you mentioned, that kind of team composition. Like if you have a whole bunch of people in the room with the same education background, the same ideas, and the same technology background stack, how are you going to push that creativity or innovation in a different direction when everyone's just agreeing with someone? You kind of need someone to be that challenger and be like, actually, how about, or why don't we? And it's, as you mentioned, those health and safety or verification and validation people, then linking up with people who are product developers or super creative in terms of like their R&D approach or whatever it may be. So I think that's, yeah, really interesting. And I mean, has there been anything that you can share kind of in your experience where like you've really seen that either be a massive challenge or really like make or break a project for either success or not?
I think that it's always a challenge. I think as a leader, creativity has a very special place, in that it's not always obvious in the day-to-day where you can apply it. But creativity runs at the core of, you know, everything I kind of consider and that I do, and it sort of just comes out with certain sort of variations and degrees depending on the situation. But it's very much sort of, it's really important. It's important that everybody gets in touch with their creativity, and that they try to think outside the box a little bit. Where many products that I've been involved in, especially when it comes to technology and when it comes to engineering and building stuff, I think, you know, there's a tendency to go, we did it like this before, this is exactly how we're going to follow it, and this is exactly the approach that we're going to take, and that happens. That I think that happens a lot. What needs to happen, and what I've seen, is that you need to create a safe enough environment for people to be able to express their thoughts, feelings, and processes. And, you know, all those different personalities, when facilitated in the right way, can create something that is really magical, that, you know, kind of is very different in the marketplace. And I think, you know, throughout my career that I've seen similar patterns where, you know, you follow a certain thing and you expect an outcome, and when that doesn't happen, it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, we're stuck. Like, I don't know how to move forward. Let's make it even better. Let's perfect it even more. Let's just add this thing. But realistically, you know, to create something that means a lot of people can touch it, feel it, and use it, you need all aspects of it. And the toughest part of being in leadership is balancing all those voices, making those choices, and being able to take the team along with the journey, on the journey. I think it's very easy, you know, when you are in a position of authority, to say, no, I need it to happen this way, and this is the only way that we're going to do it. And you need to be able to take all the output and say, okay, I've considered it all, and this is the direction I think we should take because of X, Y, and Z. Because you also have to consider the business side of things. I mean, if we could all just be creatives and not worry about the business side of things, that would be amazing, right? I think it's always difficult from a leadership perspective to balance everything.
And yeah, definitely don't think anyone is sat there thinking, yeah, this is a breeze, this is easy, or the amount of successful startups we'd have would, you know, grow tenfold, especially, you know, in hardware environments that are so successful. It's not just building something cool and creative, it's think about the flip side of the coin on business profitability, future direction. So I appreciate that. And I guess then if we look again at OLO for you, like, so thinking about like your time over what coming up to, you know, 2 years or so now, are there any like lessons that you've learned about either guiding or like building early stage teams that you think could be like really interesting to delve into?
I think honestly, I'm still learning in terms of building, you know, teams. I think I go back to attitude, personality, and, you know, their willingness to collaborate. I think that's all really, really important, because as long as you are willing to adapt and learn, I think you evolve yourself in that journey. So you learn from others, you learn from situations. So to be able to build a successful team, you do need a level of diversity, but, you know, there's lots of nuances around that in terms of, you know, if we're looking at STEM, if we're looking at an industry, you know, how many women are in robotics, how many people are in engineering and in this field, and, you know, are they willing to apply? Are we doing the right things out, you know, to get those candidates in the first place? But really, you need people, especially today in this world that is really, really fast paced, to be adaptable and to be able to be responsive, right? So you want people to respond to the market, to feedback, and, you know, fundamentally, I know it's probably not, you know, the core thing of employment, but I do want people to have moments where they experience some joy and fun in their job, where actually, you know, this is a really exciting field to be in, And so, exercise your creativity, utilize your experience, and be brave enough to contribute to the conversation. So that's an aspect of it.
And I think one of the most crucial things that you said there is that, you're still learning. I think if there's ever a point where someone in leadership goes, well, I know everything and I'm the best boss anyone could ask for, that's where they've made a grave mistake, because everyone is different. So your leadership style always has to continue to be evolved and be adaptable per who you're managing, but also with like business growth, like there's so many changes in the business as a business evolves over time that you can't just lead something in one way and expect it to always work. So that's probably the fact that it's still a learn, and it should always be a learn, is one of my favorite things you mentioned there. And I guess we kind of mentioned, it's not just a now situation, it's a future situation. So if we flip into like a future view and looking further ahead, on like the emerging trends piece, like what do you see that's coming out or you've heard about floating around in robotics that could create new opportunities for women?
Oh, I think it's the emergence of the robotics in the everyday. So, no longer are things going to be locked away in a warehouse. We're going to have more robots touch our everyday lives. And I think, that's quite apparent in Asia, the adoption of robotics in more normal settings like coffee shops, restaurants, and other places is much higher than UK and Europe. I think that we will see more of this emerging, and I think that is an opportunity because we all occupy the spaces. So it's not, not just women, but everybody in those spaces that contribute, that use it, that have a way of feeding back. That's where we can get involved, and we can provide those really sort out perspectives. Actually, especially when we look at certain aspects of it. Say, something as simple as a coffee shop. By going into that coffee shop, say they had a robot barista, you're making a choice. So regardless of whether you're whoever you are, you are part of driving the adoption and the decisions of robotics. And so in order for robotics to cater for everyone, we need a more diverse community entering into the robotics space. And me as an example, you don't always necessarily have to be an engineer. Of course, we also need more female engineers and more female roboticists, but all different aspects of the business require diversity, and it's the same for robotics. Now that it's moving into these everyday spaces, we definitely need more perspectives to cater for the everyday person.
Okay. And I guess, with that, it's something that's becoming more frequent in our everyday lives. When I was at the airport a few weeks ago, they actually had one of those little robot floor cleaners that were kind of going around saying, excuse me, like, please step out the way. Or, there's vending machines, you're going to Asian countries, robot baristas, like so many different varied applications. But that's, I guess, when we're looking at like, the adoption of it as well becoming into our more everyday lives. Do you think, in terms of a working perspective, this really just needs to be tracked back and implemented at an earlier educational level as well?
Oh, definitely. I think it's I don't, again, there's lots of nuances to it, and a lot of different conversations that we can have about, what societal expectations of our roles, gendered roles, could be. And I think, there's I volunteer with Girl Guides, and what's really cool about Girl Guides, and especially when they're a bit younger, is that they're unhampered by some of these expectations. And you can see, the wild creativity of younger kids, and especially, I suppose, in girls in that space where they're allowed to express themselves, and they kind of, be wildly creative with whatever they do. It's like, the sad part is sort of understanding that there is a chance that as they grow in that journey, they'll be dissuaded or be told that actually this is not a space for you. And that's really disheartening, because we're so full of creativity, and we're the ability to to use that and express that and continue not to be afraid and to feel safe enough to do so, is really important. And I definitely think there's more that we can do when it comes to encouraging, young girls into STEM, into robotics, and being the future of being a big part of the future and being able to be part of creating those solutions as well.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. If I think back to like my education and my school days, there was like a coding GCSE or like a computer programming GCSE, and I'm pretty sure in my year of 300, it was a class of 7 boys, and I'm pretty sure they were all programming something for like, I don't know if it was Roblox or like something in terms of building blocks, but why couldn't they have done, that and something in so there's maybe more inherently linked to female socialization of like, well, if I have to do this class, I have to build a Pac-Man programming application. Why can't I build any programming application with basic Python, right? And it's the different levels of creativity that can be put into it that makes you think in a different way, because maybe back in the day, programmers were used for, X, Y, Z and building back end of computers or like, whatever it may be. And now there are so many varied applications for that okay, well, you know what, we do have a full team of female mechatronics designers and programmers. It's like Grace and Andromeda, like when she built Abby, like I think what she's
Yes.
built is exceptional, and she focuses so much on women heavy engineering teams. And yes, it's pretty and pink and Disneyfied and orange and whatever, but it's the way their creativity is driven is with a bit of a different view. And I think a lot of it is the socialization as well, which is
And to that particular company, what's really cool about it is that because they've differentiated themselves, they stand out. And I
yeah,
think it brings to mind immediately. I can see the robot. Is it Abby? I think
yeah.
in my mind, I can already see it because it's something that looks entirely different. And so they're utilizing that in for the benefit, of standing out. And I think that that's also really important, is understanding that actually being different is probably could make or break your product.
Yeah, completely different level of attraction, to the aspect and implementation or like vision of a business,
Mm.
not physical attraction of I'll be the robot. Um, okay, no, so I appreciate that. And I guess we've like gone on a few like tangents. This is what I love about this type of podcast, is really having a free flowing conversation. So I really firstly want to say like thank you so much for like sharing your thoughts and insights with me. Like I've absolutely loved this chat. But before we kind of wrap anything up, is there anything that I haven't touched upon or haven't like mentioned to you yet about either women in robotics specifically or leadership and female leadership that you think people should be talking about or need to know?
I think that female leadership is such a funny sort of saying, because
We don't say male leadership, we just say
yeah, it
leadership,
should,
right?
yeah, exactly, and it should just be leadership. But I mean, at least in my journey, is recognizing that, somewhat you do have to fundamentally, it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, it's that you really need to understand yourself and your own strengths, um to be able to move from, say for example, managing into a leadership role. um and there are a lot of changes, happening, and at least from my perspective, there's a lot of female-led tech companies, female-led robotics companies that are giving, like, that are more prominent now. But fundamentally, there's still an allyship that needs to happen, because there are, as you say, a lot of male dominated spaces, and there's a very big difference between performative allyship and, really being able to support women in this space. And, we can't have those conversations in isolation. I think it's a problem that we're all experiencing in a different way, and that it still requires collaborative conversations to really solve that. And I think, we all need to be courageous in being able to raise these topics and be able to talk about them in such a way that benefits everyone. And so that is still something that I'm learning and, actively seeking out. So I've mentioned my support network, and a lot of my core support network are women in these spaces. So, but that's not saying that I don't have male allies in this space who have mentored me and you supported me in my career. I think that it would just be, it takes two to have that conversation, and I think it would be good to see people be brave enough to have that conversation, to kind of approach someone and say, hey, how can I help you with this in a very non-performative way, right? So it's
Mm.
not about seeking validation, or it's not about being able to say, oh, I made this woman's career. It's about having a genuine conversation to say, are there any things that you struggle with that you think I can support with, or any introductions that I can make? It's just, there's a whole aspect to it, and we could have probably a whole different podcast on just that as a conversation. But I think, that's where it is. That's where I feel like it is that, we need everyone to be in the space to talk about this common problem,
Mm.
where actually, if we move towards solving it, everybody benefits.
That's really interesting. It's almost like, the selfless acts of today of like what is technically not going to benefit me but could benefit something wider, or in 10, 15 years. And as you said, leadership is about knowing yourself really well and your strengths, but also learning and evolving around the strengths of the people that are around you or who are working with you, and leaning on those instead of, yeah, it's like making the right decision to lean on something at the right time, which can really like change the effect of a project, a strategy, a delivery timeline, something like that. So that's a really good piece, and thank you so much for adding that in. Yeah, Eleanor, thank you so much for, joining the show. It's honestly been such a fantastic conversation. And I'm really excited to see not just the impact women like you and me can continue to have in the robotic space over the next 5, 10, 50 years, but also the trajectory of OLO Robotics as well.
Yeah, no, super excited about the business, but also, it's always a pleasure speaking with you on this topic. And it's very nuanced, and we cover a lot of it, and we have a lot of conversations. So I continue to invite other people to come and speak to us about it, and continue having this conversation, because it's really important. So thank you very much,
Definitely.
Danielle, for inviting me onto this podcast.
Oh, thanks so much.